Turn up your frequency with love, self-care, and bite-sized brain hacks for the seeker in you. It's time to give your mind a little love with your host, Beverly J. Miller. Welcome to the Selfful Soul Care Podcast, where we explore holistic well-being and personal growth, offering you practical tips and heartful insights. Join our community and start your journey towards a more soulful, self-caring you. Subscribe today because taking care of yourself is the first step to taking care of others. Hello, welcome back to another episode of Soulful Self-Care, where we explore the many facets of nurturing or well-being. I'm your host, Beverly J. Miller, and today we're diving into a topic that's as prickly as is essential. That's setting boundaries. Have you ever felt overwhelmed, stretched too thin, or resentful because you've taken on too much? Or perhaps you found it difficult to say no, even when you knew you needed to. If so, you're not alone. Today, we'll be looking to an unlikely teacher in the animal kingdom for guidance, the porcupine. That's right. These little creatures have a lot to teach us about the art of setting boundaries. I remember the first time I encountered a porcupine. I was fascinated by how this seemingly gentle creature could instantly transform into a fortress of sharp quills when it felt threatened. It made me think about how we, as humans, can learn to protect ourselves in a world that often demands more than we can give. So let's get comfortable. Maybe grab a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, perhaps a glass of wine, and explore what porcupines can teach us about setting boundaries. Let's get to know our spiky friends a bit better. Porcupines are rodents with a unique defense mechanism, which is their quills. These quills are actually modified hairs coated with thick plates of keratin and can detach easily when a predator gets too close. The porcupine doesn't go looking for trouble, but when it feels threatened, it knows how to protect itself. This self-protection is instinctual and necessary for survival. In the animal kingdom, many creatures have developed ways to defend themselves and ensure their safety. For porcupines, their quills are a clear signal to predators, stay back or you'll get hurt. Now, let's translate this into human terms. Boundaries are essentially our personal quills. They are the limits we set for ourselves in relationships, work, and life in general to protect our well-being. You see, without boundaries, we risk overextending ourselves, feeling resentful, and ultimately burning out. But let's be clear. Setting boundaries is not about building walls or keeping people out. It's about creating healthy spaces for ourselves where we can thrive. It's about knowing where we end and others begin, ensuring we can be our best selves while still being compassionate and connected to others. So what can we learn from porcupines? First, it's important to recognize that boundaries are a form of self-care. Just like porcupines doesn't hesitate to raise its quills when necessary, we shouldn't hesitate to assert our limits. This might mean saying no to additional work when you're already overwhelmed, or setting clear expectations in relationships about what you can and cannot do. Porcupines also teach us that boundaries are not permanent fortresses. They can be adjusted depending on the situation. Similarly, our boundaries can be flexible, changing as our circumstances and needs evolve. So let's look at some practical tips for setting boundaries. First, recognize your limits. So pay attention to when you feel stressed or overwhelmed about a situation. These are indicators that you may need to set a boundary. When you recognize this, then communicate clearly. When setting a boundary, be direct and clear. Use I statements to express your needs without blaming others. Let me give you an example. I need some quiet time in the evenings to recharge. Another thing is to learn to say no. It's okay to say no without feeling guilty. Remember this. Every time you say yes to something that doesn't serve you, you're saying no to something that does. Let me say that again. Every time you say yes to something that doesn't serve you, you're saying no to something that does. Another thing is to be consistent. Once you set a boundary, stick to it. Consistency helps reinforce your limits and show others that you mean what you say. Here are some examples. In the workplace, you might set a boundary by not answering your work emails after a certain time. In relationships, you might establish a boundary by expressing your need for alone time. For personal well being, you might set a boundary by dedicating a specific time each day for self care activities. Setting boundaries isn't always easy. We often face obstacles like the fear of rejection, the desire to please others, or feeling guilty for putting ourselves first. But it's important to remember that healthy boundaries are not being selfish, not at all. They're about self respect. So, I'm going to give you some strategies for overcoming these challenges. Start small. Begin by setting small boundaries and gradually work your way up. This will build confidence and make the process less daunting. Talk to friends or a therapist about your boundary setting efforts. They can probably provide encouragement and accountability. Then reflect on your values. Remind yourself why you're setting boundaries in the first place. What do you stand to gain in terms of your mental and emotional health? I'm going to share a personal story with you about my experience with setting boundaries. You see, setting boundaries has always been a challenging journey for me, especially when it came to balancing my professional life with my personal needs. There was a time when I was juggling multiple projects, trying to be there for everyone in my family, and still finding time to write my blog. I remember feeling constantly exhausted, anxious, and on the verge of burnout. One particular incident stands out. I had agreed to take on a large project at work, thinking I could handle it on top of all my existing responsibilities. At the same time, my family needed my support for an upcoming event, and I didn't want to let them down either. I kept pushing myself, ignoring the signs of stress and fatigue. One evening, after a particularly long day, I was working late into the night, trying to meet a deadline. My phone rang, and it was my sister, needing to talk about some issues she was facing. I could hear the urgency in her voice, but I was so overwhelmed that I couldn't focus on her words. I felt a wave of guilt rush over me because I wanted to be there for her, but I simply didn't have the emotional capacity at that moment. After that call, I sat down and realized something had to change. I couldn't continue living this way, constantly torn between work and personal commitments, and never feeling like I was fully present in either. That's when I decided to start setting some boundaries. I began by having an honest conversation with myself about my workload. I determined that I needed to scale back on some projects, to maintain my well being. It was a difficult conversation to have with myself, but to my surprise, the work was distributed and some tasks were set to a more realistic deadlines. Next, I spoke with my family. I explained that while I loved being there for them, I needed to carve out some time for myself to recharge. I set specific times for family activities and made it clear that there would be moments when I might not be available immediately, but would always get back to them as soon as I could. One of the biggest changes I made was creating a no work after 8 p.m. This meant that evenings were dedicated to unwinding, spending quality time with my loved ones, and indulging in self care activities like reading or meditating. It wasn't easy at first. There were moments of doubt and guilt, but as time went on, I began to feel a significant difference. I was less stressed, more focused, and more present both at work and with my family. The boundaries I set not only helped me manage my time better, but also improved my relationships and overall well being. Looking back, I realized that setting boundaries is an ongoing process. It's about continuously assessing your needs and being brave enough to make the necessary adjustments. It's not about being perfect, but about finding a balance that allows you to thrive. So if you're feeling overwhelmed or stretched too thin, remember that it's okay to set boundaries. It's an act of self love and respect. And just like the porcupine, you have the right to protect your well being and create a space where you can truly flourish. To wrap up, remember that setting boundaries is a powerful act of self care. Just like the porcupine uses its quills to protect itself, we too must learn to protect our well being by setting and maintaining healthy boundaries. It's not always easy, but it's essential for a balanced and fulfilling life. Take some time this week to reflect on where you might need to set or adjust boundaries in your life. And as always, I love to hear your thoughts and experience. Feel free to reach out and share your stories. Thank you for being part of this journey of self care and self discovery. If you missed our previous episode on embracing imperfection, be sure to check it out. Until next time, take care, be kind to yourself, and remember your well being matters.